In the vast, unforgiving theater of the Pacific War, one aircraft represented the pinnacle of Japanese aerial agility and deadly precision, the Mitsubishi A6M-0. To the pilots of the Allied forces, it was a ghost, a predator that could turn inside any plane they threw at it. American pilots flying the rugged P-38 Lightning had one doctrine drilled into them: never, ever try to turn with a zero. It was a death sentence. But in the desperate skies over New Guinea in 1943, a lone American pilot, his fuel running low and his options exhausted, broke that rule. And against all odds, he won.
How was this possible? The answer lies not in a new super weapon or a secret engine, but in a 2-inch piece of wire, installed by a mechanic who was told his idea was, frankly, stupid. This is the story of how a simple piece of engineering ingenuity gave American pilots the one advantage they desperately needed and helped turn the tide in the Pacific. This is how a 2-inch wire defeated Japan's best fighter.
Our story begins not in the air, but on the rain-sodden muddy airfields of Port Moresby, New Guinea, in the sweltering summer of 1942. The men of the 39th Fighter Squadron, 35th Fighter Group, were living in a state of constant exhaustion and tension. They were flying the revolutionary Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine, twin-boomed fighter that was fast, heavily armed, and possessed a long range that was vital for the vast distances of the Pacific. But it was also heavy, very heavy. In a dogfight, the Zero's phenomenal turn radius made it a terrifying opponent. Japanese pilots could perform maneuvers that seemed to defy physics, twisting their nimble frames inside the turning circle of the larger, more powerful American aircraft. The P-38 pilots quickly learned the boom and zoom tactic. Dive from altitude with the sun at your back, unleash a devastating burst of fire from your 4.50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon, and then use your superior speed to climb away, never staying to mix it up in a turning fight. It was a sound tactic, but it left no room for error. A single mistake, a moment of hesitation, and the Lightning became a sitting duck. The man at the center of our story was not a pilot, but a master sergeant in charge of a maintenance crew. His name was Technical Sergeant Gary Bays. Bays was a thinker, a tinkerer, a man who knew the P-38 systems inside and out. And he noticed something. Pilots returning from harrowing engagements would often report that at high speeds, especially in a dive, the control yoke would become incredibly heavy, fighting them as they tried to pull out. This was the effect of compressibility, a phenomenon where air flowing over the wings approaches the speed of sound, creating shock waves that disrupt lift and make the controls lock up. Several pilots had been lost, not to enemy fire, but to diving straight into the jungle or the ocean, unable to recover. Sergeant Bays watched, he listened, and he began to form a theory. A theory that would be met with more than a little skepticism. The problem of compressibility was a ghost haunting the P-38 community. Engineers at Lockheed were baffled. In the skies, the threat was becoming more personal. By late 1942, Zero pilots, recognizing the P-38's reluctance to turn, had adapted their own tactics. They would lure the Lightnings down, baiting them into dives, knowing that if the American pilot stayed in it too long, he might never pull out. The psychological toll was immense. Every dive was a gamble. You were not just fighting the enemy, you were fighting the very laws of physics. Sergeant Bays, studying the wreckage of a crashed P-38 and listening to the terrified debriefings of shaken pilots, focused his attention on the wing flaps. The P-38, like most aircraft of its day, had hydraulically actuated flaps that were either fully up or fully down. Bayes theorized that if the pilot could deploy the flaps just a few degrees, it would change the camber of the wing, generating extra lift right at the point where the aircraft was trying to stall and lock up. It was a way to trick the wing into thinking it was at a lower angle of attack. But the hydraulic system was an all-or-nothing proposition. His solution was deceptively, almost laughably simple. He proposed installing a small 2-inch long metal stop, a simple piece of wire, into the flap control valve. This stop would physically prevent the pilot from moving the flap lever all the way to the full down position. Instead, when the pilot selected flaps down in an emergency, the lever would hit this stop and deploy the flaps to only 8 degrees, not the full 40. It was a crude, field-expedient modification. No blueprints, no engineering tests, just a mechanic's gut feeling. He took the idea to his superiors. The response was predictable. It was stupid. It was a bodge job. It violated the aircraft's design. What if it caused more problems than it solved? What if it got a pilot killed? The risks were too high. For weeks, Bayes was refused, but the losses continued. The fear in the pilot's eyes grew. The situation was becoming critical. The dominance of the Zero, coupled with this mysterious aerodynamic flaw, was crippling the effectiveness of one of America's most advanced fighters. Finally, with the quiet support of a squadron commander who was desperate for any solution, Bayes was given permission to modify a single aircraft on a trial basis. The plane chosen was that of a veteran and respected pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Wally Klinikowski. The atmosphere on the tarmac was thick with apprehension. The ground crew looked at the modified lever with a mixture of hope and dread. No one knew if this simple wire would be a lifesaver or a death warrant. Little did they know that within days, this modification would be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. The test came on a routine patrol over the Solomon Sea. Lieutenant Colonel Klinikowski, leading a flight of 4 P-38's, spotted a lone Japanese reconnaissance plane. It was a tempting target. He nosed his Lightning over and began a high-speed dive, his wingman following close behind. But the reconnaissance plane was a trap. As the P-38's committed to their dive, a full squadron of 12 Zeros, hidden in a layer of cloud above, dropped their own camouflage and fell upon them like hawks. The sky exploded into chaos. Tracers streaked past cockpits. The high-pitched whine of the P-38's engines and the lower growl of the Zero's radios created a deafening symphony of war. Klinikowski's wingmen managed to break away, following doctrine and using their speed to extend, but Klinikowski himself was cut off. 2 Zeros latched onto his tail, their cannon shells walking closer and closer to his aircraft. He pushed the throttle to the firewall, but the Zeros, in a short burst of speed, kept pace. He was alone, low on fuel, and with 2 of the Imperial Japanese Navy's finest pilots on his 6. The standard procedure screamed at him, boom and zoom. Don't turn, don't turn. But he had no altitude to boom from and no space to zoom. The Zeros were herding him, forcing him into a maneuver they knew he couldn't win. He could see the pilots in his mirror, confident, closing for the kill. In that moment, the conventional wisdom offered no salvation. To follow the book was to die. The crisis was absolute. He was seconds from being shot out of the sky. The 2 Zeros began to tighten their turn, anticipating the easy kill. They knew the P-38 was a lumbering giant in a knife fight. They were right. Or at least, they should have been. With options evaporating as fast as his fuel, Klinikowski made a decision that went against every fiber of his training. He took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to the mechanic who had tinkered with his plane, and slammed the flap lever down. It jerked in his hand, stopping short with a solid mechanical thud
that he could feel through the yoke. He hadn't even looked to see if the flaps had deployed. There was no time. He hauled the control yoke back and to the right, throwing his massive Lightning into a hard, turning climb. The aircraft shuddered, the airframe groaning under the immense G-forces. He braced for the stall, for the controls to lock up, for the inevitable spin. But it never came. Instead, the P-38 carved a turn that was, by its own standards, impossibly tight.
The 2-0 pilots, anticipating a slow, predictable target, overshot in an instant. Their perfect kill shot was gone. The look of shock in their cockpits was palpable even from a distance. Their prey had just performed a maneuver that was supposed to be impossible. Klinikowski, his heart pounding in his chest, couldn't believe it. The aircraft was responsive, alive in a way it had never been before. He had bled off a great deal of speed, but he had retained control. The 8 degrees of flap had done exactly what Sergeant Bays had predicted. They had generated just enough extra lift to keep the wings from stalling, allowing him to outturn the premier turning fighter of the war. Now the roles were reversed. The Zokes were slow and vulnerable in front of him. He didn't hesitate. He lined up the lead 0 in his gun sight and pressed the trigger. The combined fury of his cannons and machine guns tore the fragile Japanese fighter to pieces. The second 0, stunned by the reversal, broke off and fled. The sky, moments ago a certain tomb, was now his. He returned to Port Moresby on fumes, his mind racing. He landed, taxied to his hardstand, and cut the engines. For a long moment, he just sat in the cockpit, the silence ringing in his ears. He climbed down, walked straight over to a nervous-looking Jerry Bays, and didn't say a word. He just pointed at the flap lever, then gave the mechanic the most powerful handshake of his life. The message was clear. The stupid wire trick had worked. It had saved his life and given him a victory against impossible odds. Word spread through the squadron like wildfire. Suddenly, every pilot wanted Bay's modification on their aircraft. That 2-inch piece of wire became the most valuable piece of equipment in the South Pacific. The impact of Sergeant Bay's field modification was immediate and profound. Official reports were filed, and Lockheed engineers, who had been struggling with the compressibility issue for months, were astounded by the elegant simplicity of the solution. They refined the concept, creating a proper combat flap setting that became a standard feature on all subsequent P-38 models. This single innovation transformed the Lightning's dogfighting capabilities. It was no longer just a fast, high-altitude interceptor. It could now hold its own in a low-level brawl when necessary. While Sergeant Gerhard Bays never received a formal medal for his ingenuity, a common fate for many ground crew whose contributions were vital but unseen, his legacy was written in the skies.
His modifications saved countless pilots and aircraft, contributing directly to the Allied air supremacy that would eventually strangle Japanese forces in the Pacific. The P-38, with its newfound agility, went on to become one of the most successful and feared American fighters of the war, the mount of aces like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire. The story of the 2-inch wire is more than just a tale of engineering cleverness. It is a testament to the unsung heroes of World War II, the mechanics, the technicians, the ground crew. These men, with their grease-stained hands and pragmatic minds, often held the key to victory as much as the pilots who flew the missions.
It is a story of innovation, born from desperation, of a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, and of the quiet, unbreakable bond between a pilot and the man who keeps his plane in the air. It was a small fix for a giant problem. A humble piece of wire that helped clip the wings of the Zero. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to the War Archives as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.